Jared Yates Sexton grew up in rural Indiana in a working-class family. His childhood was often filled with violence, abuse, and poverty.
My first stepfather was incredibly physically abusive. My second stepfather was verbally abusive. And then my third stepfather actually spent some time in prison. So the model that I was given, with the exception of a couple of father figures who were able to sort of give me guidance and a little bit of an idea of how you could be outside of that model, what I saw was a really toxic strain of masculinity in which men were not to be emotional. They were to be invincible and strong at all times. And the only appropriate emotional response to anything was anger or violence.
Many feel this mindset of how a man should act is pervasive in our society. The macho, ultra-masculine image present during Sexton's upbringing stayed with him for several years into adulthood.
I really put myself through a lot of self-abuse. I abused substances. I had terrible relationships. And what was happening the whole time was I was playing a character until one day I wasn't playing a character. It's just who I was. And for a long time, men put on that armor of masculinity until they don't realize they're wearing the armor anymore.
Sexton has studied this issue for a long time as a journalist and is now the author of a new book called The Man They Wanted Me to Be: Toxic Masculinity and a Crisis of Our Own Making. The book incorporates ethnographic research with Sexton's personal anecdotes, aiming to bring awareness to this dark side of masculinity. Recounting his own life, Sexton uncovers what drives some men to act this way.
I grew up a very sensitive child who was sort of looked at untrustingly by the men around me. They thought I was soft. And I think a lot of men, when they're young, when they're boys, they're not able to do this. They're upset. Their first idea is to go ahead and cry or be emotional. And then they're socialized to believe that that's wrong. And so for the rest of their lives, men know that this isn't natural and they feel like something's wrong with them. So they have to create a character.
Sexton witnessed this forced male persona firsthand when he was a young child.
My father he went into the Marine Corps in order to fight in Vietnam and actually became so frightened of the prospect that he was able to get out of the service before he went to fight. Because he had that shame that he avoided conflict, he overcompensated and created a persona for himself. He would wear Marine Corps hats. He'd watch Patton all the time. He would be boisterous and, quite frankly, fascistic in a lot of his beliefs. And so he performed this character for a very long time that was meant to sort of bolster his insecurities. Later on in life, when we got closer, he actually admitted to me that he knew that this was a character, that this was a lie that he was carrying on, but he had to do it because he was afraid. He had to do it because he was insecure.
According to Sexton, it's socialization that partially led his father to create a caricature of himself. His father internalized what society deemed as normal for a man and then responded like he felt he was supposed to. This societal stigma can lead to long-term problems.
Studies have actually shown that men are so socialized to not listen to their feelings that they actually become numb to them. They aren't even able to actually understand what's happening with them. And because they don't have the ability to express themselves to those they're intimate with, they don't have an ability to do anything besides be violent or be angry. And that further pushes people away and it further isolates themselves. So the abuse gets worse and worse and worse as the frustration compounds on itself.
Men's socialization to hide their emotions can be mentally taxing and dangerous. Studies show that men are routinely diagnosed with depression half as often as women. But in the book, Overcoming Masculine Depression, The Pain Behind the Mask, psychologists Dr. John Lynch and Dr. Christopher Kilmartin say this statistic does not show the whole story. They say the very definition of depression favors symptoms commonly associated with women, such as feelings of worthlessness or guilt. These are internal struggles some men are socialized not to outrightly express, so they stay hidden beneath the surface. For Sexton, there was only one man in his life who went against the grain of his other fatherly figures.
My grandfather was a pretty incredible man. He was a war hero in World War II and earned a Purple Heart and all these other awards. And back in America, although he soothed his PTSD with alcohol, he was an incredibly sensitive man. He's the one who taught me that it was okay to cry, to be emotional. And he was able to be emotional and be sensitive because he had earned that right as a war hero. The family just sort of acknowledged that because he had done his part, that he deserved the right to not necessarily be, this traditional masculine model. So he was incredibly important to me in forming who I was.
For many boys and men who don't have a figure like Sexton's grandfather to emulate, it can be tough to break this dangerous generational cycle of masculinity.
They feel like there's something wrong with them. There's something that's happened to make them faulty. And so anytime that they experience some sort of frustration, whether or not it's social shame or economic shame or personal shame, there has to be some sort of overcompensation.
This overcompensation can lead to acts of domestic violence. In Sexton's childhood home, he witnessed several instances where a father figure had no other way to deal with frustration than to respond with anger and violence.
You would see the men in my family would come home from work and they would either be frustrated with their job and unable to complain about their job because to complain is not a manly thing, or they would be shamed by someone at work or a supervisor, or there'd be a financial problem. There'd be some sort of embarrassment. And you could see day by day a correlation between that personal shame and the familial abuse that took place. And it just became very clear that they were overcompensating for something else and taking the frustrations out on the people around them.
This behavior of internalizing stress and emotions can result in a less fulfilled and overall shorter lifespan for men.
The scariest thing about all of this is that men live shorter lives. And these are self-inflicted wounds that are happening. Men are much more likely to abuse substances. They're much more likely to take risks with their lives. They're completely afraid to go to the doctor. It's amazing the statistics there that men compound all of these illnesses that could be treated because they're afraid of going to the doctor, which of course is antithetical to the idea of masculinity, that you're supposed to be strong and never afraid.
But this kind of toxic masculinity doesn't stay behind closed doors. Sexton began to observe this trait when he was reporting at political rallies back in 2016.
I started noticing at these Trump rallies that these young men in the audiences would egg each other on to say some really awful, terrible, racist, misogynistic, fascist things. And what ended up happening was, by observing them, I started to notice that they were competing over who could be the most masculine. And this was the kind of thing that you would see constantly, whether or not it was in the home or at a bar or in a locker room. You would see men puffing up their chest and saying these really awful things when they were alone with one another in order to overperform. But it so happened that it moved from the interior, from behind closed doors, to out in the world as it became a political phenomenon.
Sexton can't help but correlate some of our current political landscape with toxic masculinity. He calls Trump an alpha male, or the pinnacle of this notion of American masculinity. But Sexton also points to the stereotype as no longer holding any advantages in the workplace.
American masculinity has its roots in labor and industry, and these ideas that you're supposed to go in, do your work, and not complain was most prevalent when people had to go into factories and not complain. They were just cogs in a machine, and then they went home. Now there's no economic advantage to that. Our changing economy emphasizes these non-masculine things such as communication, cooperation, and expression. And these are things that we've been taught not to do. So what we're seeing with new generations now is they're embracing a lot more of the masculinity that allows for both a masculine expression, but also the ability, again, to communicate and cooperate.
So where do we go from here? Sexton encourages young men to build a community and embrace their sensitivity early on.
I think that for a lot of young men, particularly who come from rural, conservative areas, they don't always have that. They're constantly being inundated with symbols that something is wrong with them and that something is deficient with them. And I think that everybody needs something or somebody in their life that reassures them that however they are, it's okay and that they're not alone.
Luckily, there is hope. A society where men embrace their emotions and don't hide behind violence and macho tendencies is possible.
The biggest antidote to this is conversation and observation. The reason why gender roles have been pervasive for as long as they have is because they've never been questioned. It's always been perceived as some sort of biological factor, but instead it's completely societal and it's totally constructed. And once you start considering these things and where they've come from, both from a political and a consumer perspective, you start to realize how this has come to be constructed and how it's used to hold people back.
Sexton encourages all of us to take a step back and analyze the implications of gender norms. Many previously held notions around gender don't hold up under further inspection. Gender, like many things in society, is fluid. It can change and evolve as time goes on. Conversations taking place today have the power to inspire change tomorrow. You can find out more about Jared Yates Sexton's new book, The Man They Wanted Me to Be, through a link on our website, viewpointsonline.net. Our studio producer is Jason Dickey. This segment is produced by Annie Krall and Amira Zaveri. I'm Marty Peterson.
Viewpoints returns in just a moment.